The river comes first, before any king or stone. Every summer it rises, spreading across the valley and leaving behind a thin skin of black silt. That silt is what makes life here possible. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, the black land, named for the mud rather than the sand around it. Egypt grew out of that mud. The calendar, the harvest, the taxes, even the gods answered to the water. For 3,000 years, this rhythm held. Kingdoms rose and fell against it, and still the river returned each year, indifferent and reliable. What we are following tonight is not one age but many, stacked on top of each other. It is a civilization so old that its own people walked among ruins they could no longer fully explain. The pyramids were already ancient when Cleopatra was born. Egypt spent much of its history tending a past it had begun to forget. This is a story about how a way of life outlasted death, collapse, and conquest. It moves slowly, through river villages and workmen's houses, through painted tombs and quiet accounts scratched onto stone. From the mud at the water's edge to a civilization so old it grew ancient to itself. If you find this kind of patient, immersive exploration meaningful, a like and a subscription help the next story get made. Sharing with a single person who thinks this way is the most powerful thing you can do. Let your shoulders settle. Let the day loosen its hold. And allow the room to grow still as we return to the banks of the Nile. This is 3,000 years of Egypt. The Black Land had a border and everyone could see it. Where the silt ended, the desert began, as sharp as a coastline. A person could stand with one foot in dark soil and the other in dead sand. The Egyptians named the two halves separately, and they never confused them. Kemet was the Black Land, the narrow ribbon of dark earth along the water. Deshret was the Red Land, the sand pressing in from either side. One was life. The other was where the dead were buried, out beyond the reach of the flood. That black soil was not native to Egypt at all. It came from somewhere else, carried down over enormous distances. Far to the south, in the highlands of Ethiopia, summer rains stripped mineral-rich earth from the mountains. The floodwater carried it north for hundreds of miles and laid it down across the valley. Each year the river arrived heavy with someone else's mountains. So the fertile land was not simply found. It was delivered. The arable ground that fed millions was manufactured every summer, spread thin across the floor of the valley and left to dry. Nowhere else did farming depend so completely on a gift from upstream. Egypt was a country that the river rebuilt from scratch, one flood at a time. A civilization built on that rhythm needed a way to keep time by it. The Egyptians divided their year into 3 seasons, and each one belonged to the water. The first was Akhet, the inundation, when the river spread out and covered the fields. Nothing could be planted then. The land simply lay underwater and waited. For weeks the valley became a sheet of shallow water, broken only by the raised mounds where the villages stood. Farmers watched their fields disappear and knew this was exactly as it should be. The drowning of the land was the promise of the harvest. When the flood withdrew, the second season began. This was Peret, the emergence, when the soil reappeared dark and soft and ready. Seed went into the ground while the memory of the water was still fresh. The fields greened, the grain rose. Then came Shemu, the harvest, the hot, dry months when the crop was cut and gathered. In Shemu, the river shrank back to its lowest, thinnest self, a narrow channel far below the cracked and waiting banks. And then, when the heat was at its worst, the star returned, and the whole cycle began again. 3 seasons, and not one of them named for the sun. The whole calendar answered to the flood. Work, worship, hunger, rest, all of it followed the water rather than the sky. Time itself was measured against the river, but the flood needed announcing before it arrived. And the sign came, strangely, from the stars. Each year, a single bright star vanished from the night sky for about 70 days, lost in the glare near the sun. Then, one morning before dawn, it reappeared low on the horizon. The Egyptians called it Sopdet. We call it Sirius. Its return, just ahead of the flood, marked the beginning of the year. Priests learned to watch for that first faint rising and read it as a promise. The water was coming and the year had turned. To catch it, an observer had to rise before dawn and search the eastern horizon at the right hour. The star showed for only a few minutes before the sunrise washed it out. Missing it meant waiting another day. In a land with no rain to speak of, the calendar began not with a season, but with a star, glimpsed low in the grey light before morning. There was a flaw hidden inside this system, and it moved slowly. The Egyptian civil year ran to 365 days, with no leap day to catch the quarter day left over. So the calendar slipped. About one day every 4 years, it drifted out of step with the real solar year. The drift was tiny, almost invisible in a single lifetime. A person might live and die without ever noticing that the new year had shifted. But over centuries it added up. The season names slowly came unmoored from the seasons they described, until the festival of the flood might fall in the dry heat instead. Given enough time, the calendar wandered a full turn through the year before finally realigning, a cycle stretching across roughly 1400 years. The Egyptians ran the most orderly state in the ancient world on a clock that was always quietly losing its place. None of this mattered as much as one number: the height of the flood. A high flood meant full fields and full granaries. A low one meant less planting, less grain and hunger by the following spring. Everything depended on how far the water rose, so the Egyptians built instruments to measure exactly that. They were called nilometers. Some were nothing more than a marked column standing in the river. Others were elaborate stone staircases descending into the water, corridor after corridor, each step numbered. They were placed at key points along the river, at Elephantine in the far south, on an island at Cairo, in the shadow of temple walls. As the flood climbed, priests read the level against the marks. They counted it out in standardized cubits and palms, and they wrote the number down. A wet line on stone became one of the most important figures in the kingdom. These readings were not idle observation. They were the foundation of the entire economy. The peak height of the flood, set the tax rate for the coming year. A strong flood promised a rich harvest, so the state assessed more. A weak one meant less to give, and less was demanded. A priest reading a wet stone wall was, in effect, writing every farmer's tax bill for the year. And the readings carried a colder truth as well. When the records were gathered across many years, a pattern emerged. Roughly one flood year in every 4 fell short of the ideal. That was not bad luck striking at random. It was built into the system. Famine, in other words, was statistical. Every Egyptian lived under a steady background risk that the river would underdeliver, a risk closer to 1 in 4 than to some rare catastrophe. The good years were real, but so was the arithmetic underneath them. The danger did not only come from too little water. Too much was just as ruinous. A flood that rose beyond its usual height could sweep away the very things it was meant to nourish. It tore out canals and drowned the mud-brick villages. It wrecked the works that carried the water across the land. The ideal flood sat inside a narrow band, high enough to feed the fields, low enough to spare them. The river could ruin a community by giving too generously, as easily as by giving too little. So people learned to manage the water rather than simply wait for it. When the flood withdrew, it did not reach every field on its own. The land had to be coaxed, lifted, carried. The oldest tool for this was the shaduf, a long pole balanced on a frame, with a bucket at one end and a counterweight at the other. A single person could swing it, dip, and pour, raising water from the river to the ditch above. The rhythm of it was hypnotic. Dip, swing, pour, and back again, hour after hour under the sun. A skilled worker could keep it going all day, the counterweight doing half the labor, the arms doing the rest. In time, the technology grew. The shaduf gave way in places to the sakia, a wheel of pots turned by an ox walking in slow circles. The animal replaced the aching shoulder, and the wheel lifted water without pause. Each advance moved more water with less human effort, and each one decided something very concrete. It decided how much land a single household could keep alive through the dry months. The shaduf never truly disappeared. Along parts of the Nile Valley today, farmers still work the same counterweighted pole their ancestors used in the Bronze Age. The bucket dips, the weight rises, the water pours into the channel. A tool 5,000 years old still lifts water by the same simple lever, long after the civilization that spread it has gone. Beyond these hand tools lay a larger, humbler labor. The irrigation basins and canals that carried the flood across the fields did not maintain themselves. Every year they silted up and had to be dug out again. So every year the state called in ordinary farmers, season by season, to clear the channels and repair the banks. This was the corvée in its plainest form, a draft of labor owed to the state. It raised no pyramids and carved no statues. Men waded into the mud with baskets and simple tools, hauling out the silt that last year's flood had dropped. The work was hot, wet, and endless, and it had to be done again the next year and the year after that. It left almost nothing behind. Yet it was the true daily face of the whole system, the quiet labor of keeping ditches open so that water could reach the grain. The monuments remember the kings. The canals, dug and cleared by countless unnamed hands, remember no one. While the fields kept their seasonal time, the Egyptians also learned to measure the smaller hours. By night, they read the slow procession of the stars. By day, they watched shadows creep across marked stone or listened to water drip steadily from one vessel into another. From these instruments came a habit that outlived them entirely. They split the daylight into 12 hours and the darkness into 12 more. The shape of our own day, cut into 2 sets of 12, is partly an Egyptian inheritance. That same instinct for the standard measure reached into stone. Length was set by the royal cubit, based on the forearm from elbow to fingertip. It was fixed against master rods kept as references, so that a cubit meant the same thing whether measured in the north or the south. Because that unit stayed consistent from site to site, the great monuments could be built to a precision that still surprises. Blocks weighing many tons met their neighbors within a hair. A measure taken from the human body, rigorously standardized, sits quietly behind the accuracy of the pyramids. All of this order, the calendar, the tax, the measured field, had to be written down somewhere. And Egypt had a material for exactly that. Papyrus grew thick in the marshes of the delta, and the Egyptians learned to cut its stalks, layer the strips, and press them into smooth, pale sheets. It became the paper of the ancient world. Papyrus was more than a convenience. It was a state industry and an export. Workshops harvested the reeds, sliced the pith into thin strips, and laid them crosswise before pressing and drying them into sheets. Those sheets were then glued end to end into long rolls, ready for the scribe's brush. Sheets of it traveled across the Mediterranean, sold to distant kingdoms that had no reeds of their own. The very material that carried Egypt's endless records was also a commodity that helped pay for them. Bureaucracy, quite literally, sold itself abroad. Yet the most complete record of Egyptian life did not survive on fine papyrus at all. It survived on trash. In one village on the dry western bank, the artisans who cut the royal tombs kept their own records. They scribbled the day's business onto broken chips of limestone, the scrap paper of the ancient world. They wrote on whatever was underfoot. Because that village sat in bone-dry desert, the chips never rotted. Papyrus would have crumbled to nothing in wetter ground. But limestone in dry sand simply waited. Thousands of the chips lasted. Grocery lists, quarrels, wages owed, complaints about a lazy foreman, notes of love and debt, all scratched onto stone and thrown aside. None of it was ever meant to survive. It was written to be used once and forgotten. And yet it left behind the most thoroughly documented community of the entire ancient world. A single street of workmen, overheard clearly across 3,000 years, all because the ground was too dry to let their rubbish disappear. Among that rubbish, in a sense, was a logbook that survived by the same accident. It surfaced not in the desert village, but far to the east, at a harbour on the Red Sea called Wadi al-Jarf. Archaeologists opened it in 2013, and inside were the daily notes of a man named Mera. Mera was an inspector, middle-ranking, unremarkable in his own time. He kept a record the way a foreman keeps a record, day by day, without ceremony. His boatmen ferried white limestone across the Nile to Giza. That limestone became the outer skin of the Great Pyramid. The stone came from Tura on the far bank of the river. Mera's crews loaded it, floated it downriver, and unloaded it at the foot of the rising monument. And in the margins of that work, almost offhandedly, he logged something else entirely. He recorded the rations his men received: bread, beer, dates. Amounts distributed on a schedule to named groups of workers. This is the quiet detail that changes everything. It is a payroll 4,500 years old, written by a man who had no idea he was answering a question the future would ask. There is something almost tender in how ordinary it is. Mera was not making a case. He was not defending the honor of the workforce or arguing with anyone. He was keeping accounts, the way accounts have always been kept, because rations had to be tracked and someone had to sign off on them. And that is precisely why it carries such weight. A monument boasts. A tomb inscription flatters the dead. But a logbook has no reason to lie. It records what actually moved and what the men actually ate on days that no one expected anyone to remember. Because the future did ask it. Who built this, and how were they held there, out on the plateau, moving stone in the heat? The answer begins in the kitchens. Not far from the pyramids, excavators led by Mark Lehner uncovered the machinery that fed the site. There were bakeries, but not household ovens. These were industrial, laid out in rows, built to turn out bread in enormous volume. Beside them stood facilities for processing fish, gutted and salted, and stored at a scale no single family would ever need. This was catering for a small city. The diet was rich in protein, deliberately so. Someone had decided these workers needed to be strong and fed them accordingly. That decision tells you something before any inscription does. You do not build ovens like that for people you intend to work to death. You build them for a workforce you mean to keep. Feeding them was only part of the operation. Building the pyramids consumed the landscape around it in ways that are easy to miss. The tools were copper. Chisels and saws, soft by modern standards, resharpened constantly. But the hidden appetite was for mortar. Gypsum mortar was mixed in vast quantities, used to lubricate the great blocks into place and to set them once they arrived. And mortar had to be heated. Heating it took fuel, and fuel meant wood. So the crews cut the acacia. The forests that had stood around Giza were fed, load by load, into the fires that made the paste that held the stone. By the time the last casing block was set, the trees were gone. The pyramid left a mark not only in stone, but in the emptied land that once surrounded it. We tend to imagine the pyramid as a thing added to the desert, dropped onto empty sand. It was closer to the opposite. To raise it, a living landscape had to be spent. The trees, the fuel, the mortar, the labor of thousands of hands, all of it drawn out of the surrounding country and pressed into a single shape. The monument stands. The forest that helped build it does not. Some of the stone resisted from the start. In the granite quarries at Aswan, far to the south, a single obelisk still lies where it was abandoned. It is enormous, larger than any obelisk ever successfully raised. and it never left the bedrock. A crack ran through it during the cutting. The flaw made it useless, and the workers simply walked away, leaving the method frozen in place around it. You can still see how they did it. They pounded the granite with balls of dolerite, a stone harder than the granite itself, bruising the rock loose grain by grain. To split it, they drove wooden wedges into a line of cut slots, then soaked them with water. The wood swelled, and the pressure cracked the stone along the seam. The unfinished obelisk is a failure, and that is exactly why it teaches so much. A finished monument hides its making. This one shows the labor, mid-gesture, forever incomplete. Now the question sharpens. Where did the bodies come from? The ones swinging the dolerite and hauling the sledges. They came from the fields at a very particular time of year. The system was called the corvée, a seasonal draft on the peasantry. And it was timed with real cunning to the rhythm of the river itself. When the Nile rose and flooded the farmland, the fields vanished under water. There was nothing to plant, nothing to harvest, nothing to do. So the state reached for those idle hands. The same flood that fed Egypt also emptied the farms of work, and the pharaohs' builders were waiting to collect. The men who cut the stone in one season were the men who grew the grain in another. They did not arrive as a nameless mass. They were sorted into gangs, competing units with real identity, and the names they carried have survived. One crew called themselves the drunkards of Menkaure. Another took a name tied to their king's stamina, their endurance, their pride. These are not the labels of a slave column. They are team names closer to what you would scratch on a locker or shout across a workshop. They imply rivalry, morale, a wish to be better than the gang working the next ramp over. Anonymous chattel do not name themselves after their own thirst and laugh about it. The gangs were smaller than the legend suggests too. We picture armies of stone draggers, tens of thousands straining on a single block. The reality was more modest. A hauling crew ran to perhaps 10 or 20 men, working in rotation, relieved and rotated out as the seasons turned. The monuments were not raised by one vast enslaved multitude. They were raised by many small teams, drafted, fed, organized, and sent home again. Slowly, the picture assembles itself into something the old stories got badly wrong. For centuries, the image was fixed. Enslaved masses under the whip, dying in their thousands to satisfy a god-king's vanity. Herodotus suggested it. Hollywood painted it in wide, cruel strokes. And archaeology has taken it apart, piece by piece. The workers were paid in the grain and bread and beer that Mera logged. They were fed from the industrial kitchens at the plateau's edge. And when they were hurt, they were treated. The evidence for that last point does not come from any inscription. It comes from their bones. In the cemetery of the workers at Giza, the skeletons tell the cost of the work in plain terms. The damage is severe and consistent. Spines compressed, joints worn through, backbones bent by years of lifting weight the human frame was never meant to carry. These were bodies broken by the stone, whatever their legal standing. But look closer at the same bones, and something unexpected appears. Many of the fractures had healed. Not healed badly, not left to knit however they fell. They had been set, properly set, aligned and splinted, the way a careful physician sets a break so it mends straight. That single fact overturns the whole cruel picture. You do not splint a disposable man. You do not nurse a slave back to strength if he is only meant to be used up and replaced. Someone stopped the work, tended the injury, and waited for the bone to knit. These men were worth healing. The medicine behind those healed bones was real and surprisingly practical. Egyptian healers dressed open wounds with honey, whose power to hold back infection modern science has since confirmed. They closed cuts with linen stitches. They bound broken limbs in padded wooden splints, snug enough to hold the bone in line while it mended. None of that is magic. It is close observation, refined over generations, and applied to men hurt on the job. The splinted fractures in the Giza cemetery are simply the physical echo of that care, left in the one archive that cannot be edited, the body itself. One skeleton pushes the point further than seems possible. A worker had lost a leg, not to accident, but to a deliberate surgical amputation. The bone shows the clean line of the cut. And it shows something more. It shows healing, extensive healing, the slow remodeling that only happens in a body that goes on living. He survived the operation. Then he survived roughly 14 years beyond it. 14 years, one-legged, in a world without mercy for the useless, which means he was not treated as useless. Someone carried him through the surgery, and a community carried him through the years that followed. That is not the arithmetic of slavery. And when the workers finally died, they were not discarded. They were buried with care in the shadow of the very monument they had raised. Their graves held provisions for the journey ahead, jars of bread, jars of beer, the same rations that had sustained them in life, packed now for eternity. Think about what that means. To lie in death beside the pyramid, equipped for the afterlife, was a privilege. It placed a stonemason within reach of the king's own immortality. No one grants that to property. It is an honor extended to men whose labor was understood to matter. None of this makes the work gentle. Egypt could still spend lives without flinching, and in the mines it often did. Out in the Sinai and the eastern desert, expedition crews went searching for turquoise, for copper, for the stones that decorated the tombs. And the graffiti they left behind is grim. Some of it records the dead. Men lost on the expeditions, and in more than one case, the cause is named plainly. They died of thirst. The luxury that gleamed on a statue or a coffin was purchased, sometimes with the lives of men sent into country with no water. The care shown at Giza did not reach every corner of the system. Back at the tombs, though, the workers eventually discovered something about their own labor that no pharaoh had taught them. They discovered they could withhold it. It happened under Ramesses III, generations after the Great Pyramids were built. The men cutting the royal tombs depended on a supply chain of grain, delivered on schedule, the wage that fed their families. And the supply chain broke. The grain did not come. They waited. 18 days passed with no rations. And then these workers, skilled and organized and entirely out of patience, did something without precedent in the whole record of human labor. They stopped. They walked off the job. They marched past the guards of the necropolis and sat down inside the mortuary temples, in the sacred spaces where the offerings were kept. It was a sit-in, thousands of years before the phrase existed. The Turin Strike papyrus records it, dryly, in the same administrative hand that recorded everything else. This is the first labor strike anyone wrote down, and its logic is startlingly modern. The workers understood that their labor was the thing that raised the tomb. Withhold it, and the whole machine stopped. They had been paid, which meant they could be underpaid. And being underpaid, they refused. Not every body that served the state was bent over stone. Some were bent over papyrus. And they paid a price too, one written just as clearly into the skeleton. At the Old Kingdom necropolis of Abusir, the remains of scribes have been examined, and their bones carry a distinct signature of wear. The neck, the shoulders, the jaw, arthritic, worn, damaged by decades of the same posture. They spent their working lives hunched forward over a scroll, holding one position for hours, day after day. The jaw damage has a particular cause. To write, a scribe chewed the end of a rush stem, fraying it into a soft brush. Years of that chewing left its mark in the bone. The prestige profession, the one that lifted a man above the fields, had a body count of its own. It was quieter than the quarry, but it was there, pressed into the joints of men who never lifted a stone. Those same joints woke before the sun. The street they woke into was narrow, a single line of houses pressed wall to wall against the desert. Fine dust lay over everything, over the walls and the doorways. It was a village built for one purpose, set apart in the dry hills. Its front doors opened onto a lane, barely wide enough for two men to pass. Step through one of those doors and the first room is not for cooking or sleeping. It holds a raised platform against the wall, a small enclosed shrine lifted off the floor. This was where a woman gave birth. Here, in the front of the house, a new life came into the world. It was also where the family's ancestors were kept close, painted or named, watching over the room. The dead and the newborn shared this single space by design. The two things belonged together in the same corner. The beginning of a life and the memory of those who came before shared one wall. And it sat at the front of the house, where anyone stepping in from the street would meet it first. Behind that room, the house opened inward. A central column of wood held up the ceiling of the main room, the heart of the home. This was where the family gathered, sat, and slept through the cool of the night. Beneath the floor there were cellars cut for storage, cool and dark, holding grain and jars. Toward the back, the kitchen sat open to the sky. Its roof was left off so the smoke of the cooking fire could rise and escape into the desert air. A whole life fit into these few narrow rooms. Birth at the front, food at the back, the dead kept near the living the entire way through. The men who lived here worked to a rhythm that feels oddly familiar. They worked 8 days, then rested 2. 10 days made their week, and the last 2 were their own. On those free days they saw their families, tended their own affairs, and sometimes crossed to the tombs they were building to prepare their own resting places. It is easy to assume the weekend is a modern invention. We think of it as something won slowly, over centuries of factory struggle and hard-fought reform. But here, more than 3,000 years ago, in a dusty village in the hills, men already lived by a cycle of labor and rest. It is a cycle any worker today would recognize at once. The shape of the working week is far older than we tend to think. We know their days in remarkable detail because someone was always writing them down. Scribes kept registers of who came to work and who did not. Beside each absent name, they recorded the reason. The reasons are what make the village feel suddenly alive. A man was ill. A man was brewing beer. A man was making an offering to his God. One entry notes that a worker stayed home because his daughter was bleeding and needed him near. Others record arguments with a wife or a man simply too hungover to climb the hill to the tombs. The surveillance was total. Every missed morning was noted and explained. But what that surveillance captured was not crime or idleness. It was ordinary life, the small troubles and duties that keep a person home on any given morning, in any century. For all this careful record, the village could not feed or water itself. It sat apart in the dry hills, far from the river and its green fields. The skilled artisans lived inside the walls, but they depended on people who lived outside them. These were the semditi, the servants of the tomb. They were the water carriers, the wood cutters, the washermen. Each day they hauled provisions across the desert so the village could function. Without them, the artisans could not have lasted a week. Their names rarely made it into the archive that preserved everything else. The most documented community of the ancient world rested quietly on the shoulders of an undocumented one. They walked in from the edges with water and wood and walked back out again, their names lost. The record that saved everything about the village saved almost nothing about them. Inside those walls, life was not all labor. The villagers kept animals for love, not only for use. They had dogs and cats, and some kept monkeys in their homes. These were companions, part of the household, given names and a place by the fire. When these animals died, they were buried with care. A few were laid to rest, wearing decorative collars, the same collars they had worn in life. There is nothing practical in a collar on a dead pet. It carries no meaning for the work of a tomb or a field. It is affection, plain and simple, and nothing more. It is the same impulse that leads a person today to bury a dog beneath a favorite tree. Across 3,000 years, the feeling reads exactly the same. They cared too for how they looked. Both men and women lined their eyes with kohl, a dark paste ground most often from a lead-ore called galena. The result is the heavy, ringed eye we now recognize as unmistakably Egyptian. We tend to see it as pure vanity, a fashion of painted eyes. It was that, but it was also useful. The dark line cut the harsh glare of the desert sun. It worked the way a modern athlete smudges black beneath the eyes before a game. And it may have done more still. Some believe it offered a measure of protection against the eye infections that thrived in that bright, dusty country. A gesture we read as beauty was, at the same time, something close to sunglasses and medicine. And it was worn every day by nearly everyone, from the field to the palace. They ate and drank simply, and their drink did more than quench thirst. Beer was thick and cloudy, low in alcohol, closer to a liquid bread than to anything we would drink to unwind. It filled the stomach as much as it lightened the head. Every class drank it, from laborers to officials, because it was nourishing enough to count as food. It carried real calories through a hard day of work under the sun. And it was handed out as part of a worker's wages, poured into his ration alongside grain. The national drink of Egypt was less a luxury than a meal you could pour, a portable source of strength for men who spent their days moving stone. The bread that went with it left its mark on their bodies. Grain was ground on stone querns, and the grinding shed a fine grit of sand and stone dust into the flour. There was no way to keep it out. Every loaf carried a little of the stone that made it. Chewed day after day, year after year, that grit wore the teeth down to worn, flattened stumps. And it did this to everyone. The pattern shows up in the skeletons of peasants and in the skeletons of pharaohs alike. Rich or poor, the mouths tell the same story. The one thing that fed the whole of Egypt also slowly ground down the mouths of everyone who ate it. It spared no one, from the poorest field hand to the king himself. When the work was done, they played. The game they loved was senet, a race of pieces across a grid of 30 squares. It was the great pastime of Egypt, played for the better part of 3,000 years. The wealthy owned beautiful boards of carved wood, kept in fine inlaid boxes. But you did not need a board to play. The men who cut the tombs simply scratched a grid into a slab of quarry stone or a paving block. They played there, in the dust, on their rest days with pebbles for pieces. The same game ran from the top of society to the bottom. It connected the man who carved the tomb to the man who would one day lie inside it. Both of them bent low over the same lines, moving the same pieces. And because they played, they taunted. Beside painted scenes of senet in the tombs, someone carved the players' words. One boasts that he will make his opponent watch as his piece is snatched away. The other fires back that the winning move is already his. It is trash talk, frozen in stone. The needling of two people leaning over a board, certain each of them is about to win. We can still overhear it, 3,000 years later, the ordinary competitive banter of a quiet afternoon, carved carefully into a wall meant to last forever. That same instinct for play spilled onto the scraps they wrote on. Everyday writing was done on ostraca, small chips of limestone that lay everywhere for the taking. They were the scrap paper of the ancient world, cheap and endless. But these chips did not only hold accounts and lists. Turn them over and you find doodles. There are quick caricatures and sketches dashed off in a spare moment. There are satirical drawings of animals doing the work of people. A cat herds a flock of geese. A mouse sits and is waited on like a lord, its servants scurrying around it. The world is turned upside down for a joke. The same chips that logged a day's rations, also caught a bored man's cartoons. The margins of ancient life were scribbled in, just as ours are. And on those same worn chips, they wrote about love. The village left behind poetry, and it speaks of longing in the language of the world just outside the door. A lover is compared to the flowers of the field and to the birds in the reeds. The beloved becomes the river, the plants along the bank, the green of a garden. These were not court poets working in some distant palace. These were ordinary people writing down their own hearts. And the desire they set down was filed away in the very same archive as the tax accounts and the absence lists. Bureaucracy and heartache were kept on the same limestone, in the same drawer, gathering the same dust. One poem carries a man across the water to reach the woman he loves. The Nile is in flood, swollen and dangerous, and crocodiles wait in it. But her love, he says, works on him like a spell. It turns the crocodile into a mouse. It turns the deep floodwater to dry land beneath his feet, so he might walk across to her. It is desire rendered as a magic strong enough to tame the river itself. And it was scratched onto a chip of stone, set down beside a list of who owed grain and who had missed a day's work. A grain debt and a missed day of work were the kind of thing worth writing down. For most of Egypt's long history, that record was how wealth actually moved. There were no coins. For nearly 3,000 years, one of the most sophisticated economies in the ancient world ran without a single minted piece of money. Value passed from hand to hand, but it did so through ledgers, through weights, through trust in a full granary. A man's fortune was grain in a bin and metal on a scale, and the careful account that said whose it was. To trade unlike things, they needed a shared measure. That measure was the deben, a standard weight of copper, roughly 90 grams, held steady across the whole country. It was never a coin. No one carried a deben in a pouch or pressed one into a merchant's palm. It lived only on the page, a unit of value against which anything at all could be priced. This is a strange and clever thing to have invented. A society reaches for the idea of money, a single yardstick for measuring worth, long before it ever mints an actual coin. The deben gave Egypt the arithmetic of a cash economy, while the cash itself stayed absent. A scribe could set an ox and a donkey and a wooden coffin side by side. He could reckon each one in the same terms without any metal changing hands. The surviving numbers let us look straight into an ordinary transaction. An ox was valued at about 50 deben. A donkey, roughly 16. A plain wooden coffin, 25.5. With those figures, a village could function. A man selling a beast could know its worth in copper he would never touch. He could settle the difference in grain or linen or a day's labor owed. It was money as an idea, precise and abstract, floating above a world that ran almost entirely on barter. For the people who did the work, value took a form they could eat. State laborers were not paid in copper at all. They were paid in measured rations, grain, bread and beer, handed out by volume on a fixed schedule. A wage in Egypt was calories first. It fed the worker and his household, and it carried a small surplus besides, a share of the wealth the state gathered in. The line between eating and going hungry ran straight down the middle of a ration list, and everyone knew it. Because the ration was survival, the schedule was sacred. A man could plan his month around the day the grain arrived. A delay was not an inconvenience. It was hunger, moving closer with each missed delivery. The whole arrangement rested on the state keeping its word, measure for measure, on time. When it failed to, the consequences were not abstract, and the record would one day show exactly what happened when the bread did not come. Holding this cashless system together were the great institutions of grain. Temple treasuries and state granaries did the work a bank does. They took in the surplus of good harvests, held it, and released it again when it was needed. It went to feed the crews raising a monument, to supply an army on the march, to carry a region through a lean year. The temple was a house of the gods, and it was also a vault. In a world without coins, the granary was where value was kept safe and where the whole economy came to rest. Above all this ordinary reckoning sat one substance the rest of the world could not stop wanting. Egypt had gold. Nubian gold, mined in the deserts of the south and carried north in quantities that made foreign kings ache with envy. It came from hard, waterless country, dug and washed by men who often did not return. But by the time it reached the Nile, it was simply another commodity of the south, weighed and recorded like everything else. To the powers beyond Egypt's borders, that gold was something closer to a dream. In the letters that passed between rulers of the age, the tone toward the pharaoh is almost undignified. Foreign kings write to him as petitioners. They ask, they press, they flatter, they remind him that in his country gold is said to be as common as dust. They want it for their temples, their treasuries, their daughters' dowries. What Egypt treated as a routine export of the south, other empires treated as the very measure of his power. And sometimes what a pharaoh wanted was not gold at all. In the tomb of an official named Harkhuf, who led expeditions into the far south, there survives a letter, and it was written by a child. The boy King Pepi II had heard that Harkhuf was bringing back a dancing pygmy from a distant land. It was a living wonder from the edge of the known world. The letter is giddy with excitement. The king orders that the little dancer be guarded day and night. Trusted men are to sleep beside him on the boat. They are to check 10 times a night to be sure he has not fallen into the water. Across more than 4,000 years, it is unmistakably a child, thrilled beyond patience. It survives because a proud official carved his king's delight into the wall of his grave. The coins came late, and they came with conquerors. For most of its history, Egypt had done without them. It was only the arriving Persians, and after them the Greek Ptolemies, who finally pressed minted money into ordinary use along the Nile. Cash, so often imagined as one of the oldest human inventions, was among the last things to reach Egypt. The land that had run a vast economy on grain and copper and trust took its coins second-hand from the powers that had come to rule it. And once Egypt belonged to others, its true wealth was measured in wheat. Under Rome, the harvest of the Nile became the empire's larder. Grain went north by the shipload, tribute by the millions of tons, sailing to feed a city Egypt would never see. They called it Rome's breadbasket. Whole fleets were built to carry the harvest across the sea. The bread of the Roman poor depended on the flood of a river 1,000 miles away. The river went on doing what it had always done, flooding, retreating, ripening the fields. The scribes went on counting the measures, as scribes always had. Only now the surplus fed foreign emperors, and the pharaohs who had once counted every grain for themselves were long gone. None of it, not the deben, not the ration list, not the gold or the grain tribute, could have worked without writing. Egypt was, before anything else, a civilization that wrote things down. And over 3,000 years, it did so in 4 distinct scripts, each shaped for a different purpose. There were the hieroglyphs, formal and pictorial, carved for gods and kings. They were beautiful and slow, meant to last on temple walls for eternity. But no scribe could run a country in signs that took so long to draw. So beside them grew hieratic, a flowing cursive, the shorthand a clerk could write quickly on papyrus for the daily business of administration. Later came demotic, quicker and more clipped still, the everyday hand of ordinary secular life. And at the very end came Coptic, the old language finally written in Greek letters. 4 scripts, one after another, each answering the needs of its age. The thing that held Egypt together across the centuries was not the stone. It was this evolving toolkit for keeping records, reshaped again and again so the writing could keep pace with the world it described. And yet almost no one could read it. This is where the familiar picture quietly breaks. The common image is of a land of picture writing, walls dense with signs any Egyptian might glance at and understand. The truth is the opposite. Perhaps 1 person in 20 could read and write, and likely fewer. It was a thin scribal class, holding a skill the rest of the population simply did not have. The hieroglyphs everyone associates with Egypt were, to almost all Egyptians, beautiful and silent. Literacy was not a common ability. It was power, held by the few who could turn the world into marks on a page. Because that power mattered, the record was engineered with real deliberation. There is a slab of dark basalt, the Palermo stone, carved in the 5th dynasty, that shows just how far back this instinct ran. On it, reign by reign, the early kings are set down. Each year is noted alongside the height of that year's flood, the taxes gathered, the festivals held. It is a ledger of centuries, cut into stone so it could never be quietly revised or lost. Think about what that stone represents. Someone decided that the past itself should be kept, measured, dated, accounted for, king after king. It is not a monument to a single ruler. It is a monument to record keeping itself. Egypt's long continuity was not luck or mere stability. It was a project, carefully built and endlessly maintained, of writing the past down so firmly that the present could always find its way back to it. The same machinery that preserved a dynasty could also expose its rot. In the late New Kingdom, the state turned its bureaucracy on itself and investigated the plundering of its own royal tombs. The dead kings, sealed away with their gold, were being robbed, and the robbers, it turned out, were often the very men employed to guard them. The papyri that survive from those inquiries read like case files. They carry names we still know: the Abbot, the Amherst, the Leopold. They name suspects. They record confessions dragged out under questioning. They trace corruption climbing all the way to high officials who were supposed to protect the necropolis. Watchmen took bribes. Craftsmen tunneled into tombs they had helped to seal. The paper trail meant to safeguard the dead became, instead, the lasting evidence that the men running the system were quietly stripping it bare. And the record kept its eye on smaller crimes too. One papyrus, known as Salt 124, is a dossier of complaint against a chief workman named Paneb. He was a man with authority over others, and the document lays out how he used it. It accuses him of bribery, of theft, of taking what was not his. It accuses him, worse, of repeated violent assaults on married women in the village. It is an ugly document, and it is precious for the same reason. Nothing about it is grand. It is simply the ordinary machinery of justice, grinding against a man who thought his position placed him above it. The archive that saved love poems and beer-brewing excuses also saved this. A powerful man's abuses, set down in plain writing, and a community straining to hold him to account. Not everything the scribes recorded was law or grievance. Some of it was arithmetic, and even the arithmetic tells you what kind of civilization this was. The Rind Papyrus, one of the great mathematical texts to survive, is full of problems. But they are not abstract. They ask how to divide loaves of bread fairly among a crew of workers, how to measure the area of a field, how to reckon what a granary holds. One famous problem works out how to share 9 loaves among 10 men, down to the last fraction, so that no one is cheated. Egyptian mathematics was built for rations and taxes and building, for the practical work of running a state. It was not philosophy. The numbers were tools, worked in unit fractions on a sheet of reed, answering the questions a working scribe faced every day. Behind each problem stood a real field to survey, a real crew to feed, a real harvest to divide. It was the machinery of administration, written down as arithmetic. The scribe's authority ran so deep that a man who mastered it could outlast death itself. Imhotep was a real official, the architect who designed the step pyramid, the first great monument of dressed stone. He was a builder, an administrator, a working member of the state. He held titles, kept records, solved problems. In his own lifetime, he was an important man, but a man all the same. And in the long centuries after he died, something remarkable happened to his memory. He was not merely remembered. He was worshipped. Generation by generation, his name grew larger than the buildings he had raised, until he was no longer a dead official, but a living god. A god of medicine and wisdom, prayed to by the sick, honored in his own temples. He was one of only a handful of ordinary Egyptians ever lifted to full divinity. The record that a scribe kept could, in the end, make him immortal. And that same rational habit of mind, the one that measured fields and audited tombs, reached into the body as well. There is a medical text, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, that reads almost nothing like magic. Case after case, it moves through injuries of the head and neck and chest with a cool, methodical eye. Examine the patient. Describe what you find. Name the condition. Judge whether it can be treated, 48 cases, and in only one of them does the healer reach for a spell. The rest is observation. It is a physician looking at a broken body and reasoning about it 3,500 years ago. The voice is the same steady one a scribe used to count grain. That voice, more than any pyramid, is what made Egypt last. Kings rose and fell. Cities were built and abandoned. Conquerors came from every direction and took the throne in turn. But the scribe kept writing. The flood height, the tax, the wage, the crime, the case, the law. The record was the machine that made Egypt reproducible, that let a scribe under one dynasty recognize the world set down by a scribe 1,000 years before. The stone weathered and the gold was carried off. The writing is what carried Egypt forward, one careful line at a time. And what that writing carried forward more than anything was a promise about time. The Egyptians are often remembered as a people in love with death. The tombs, the mummies, the endless preparation for a world beyond this one. It looks from the outside like a civilization turned away from living. But the closer you look, the less true it becomes. Their religion was not a cult of dying. It was a refusal to stop living. Eternity, as they imagined it, was not a strange or distant place. It was Egypt again. The same river, the same black fields after the flood, the same reeds bending in the same wind. They pictured the afterlife as a version of the world they already knew, made permanent. The harvest never failed there. The water always came. What they wanted was not escape from their lives, but their lives continued without end. So the whole apparatus of death was really an apparatus of continuation. The tomb was not a farewell. It was a plan. A careful, expensive, deeply practical plan to keep on being the person you had been, in the country you had loved, after the body gave out. But to continue, a person had to survive intact, and the Egyptians did not think of the self as a single thing. They understood a human being as a composite, assembled from several parts, each with its own nature and its own needs. Death did not end the person. It scattered these parts, and the danger was that they might never come back together. There was the car, the vital force, the double that came into being with you and lived on after you. The car needed sustenance. It fed on the offerings left at the tomb, the bread and beer and cuts of meat, and where real food failed, painted food would serve. Hunger did not end at death. It only changed what could satisfy it. There was the bar, the part closest to what we might call personality. The bay was shown as a bird with a human head, and it could move. By day it left the tomb and went out into the world of the living. But at night it had to return, and to return it needed something to come back to. It needed the body waiting where it had left it. And there was the Ak, the goal of all of it. The Ak was the blessed spirit, radiant and effective, the version of the dead that had passed every test and joined the eternal order. To become an Ak was to succeed at death. But it depended on the lower parts holding together first. This is why the body had to be preserved. Not out of sentiment, and not because the flesh itself was sacred, but because it was the anchor. It was the thing the bar recognized in the dark and returned to. Let the body decay beyond knowing, and the wandering soul would find nothing to come home to. The whole self would come apart for good. So preservation was not vanity. It was navigation. The mummy was a landmark left for a part of the self that would otherwise be lost. But surviving the journey was only half the problem. Reaching the eternal Egypt was not automatic, and it could not be bought with wealth alone. There was a threshold, and at the threshold there was a test. Every person who died had to face it, king and commoner alike. It was called the weighing of the heart. The scene appears again and again in the tomb papyri, painted with quiet precision. A great balance stands in the hall of judgment. On one pan rests the heart of the dead. On the other rests a single feather. The feather belongs to Maat, the goddess of truth and order, and it represents everything a life was supposed to be. Honest, balanced, in keeping with the way the world was meant to work. The heart was weighed because the Egyptians believed it, not the brain, was the seat of thought and conscience. It held the record of a life. Every choice, every cruelty, every kindness left its weight there. And so the test was not a matter of ritual correctness. It was a moral audit. The question was not whether you had said the right spells. The question was what kind of person you had been. If the heart was light, in balance with the feather, the person passed. If it was heavy, weighed down with the wrong they had done, they failed. Salvation hung on the tilt of a scale. The weighing did not happen in silence. It happened before a court. 42 divine judges stood assembled in the hall, the assessors, each one presiding over a particular sin. And before them, the dead person spoke. What they spoke has come down to us as the negative confession. It was not a confession of guilt. It was the opposite. One by one, the dead declared the things they had not done. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not lied. I have not taken more than my share of water. I have not caused anyone to weep. Each denial answered to one of the 42 judges. A full bench of gods addressed one clean statement at a time. It is a strange and moving document, this list of sins denied. Because in denying them, it names them. It tells us what the Egyptians thought a wrong life was made of. Cheating a neighbor at the scales, diverting water from another's field, speaking against the powerless. The great sins and the small ones stand side by side, and a person had to answer for all of them before they could pass. And what waited for those who failed was not what most of us picture when we think of divine punishment. There was no lake of fire. There was no eternal torment, no place of suffering that went on forever. The Egyptian idea was quieter, and in its way more terrible. Beside the scale crouched a creature called Ammit. She was a chimera, assembled from the 3 most fearsome animals the Egyptians knew. The head of a crocodile, the 4 quarters of a lion, the hind quarters of a hippopotamus. She waited for the hearts that failed the weighing. And when a heart proved too heavy, she ate it. To have your heart devoured by Ammit was not to be sent somewhere worse. It was to end. The self was annihilated. wiped out entirely, dropped into what the Egyptians called eternal oblivion. There would be no continuation, no eternal Egypt, no return of the bar to the body. There would simply be nothing, forever. That was the worst thing they could imagine. Not pain without end, but the erasure of the person as if they had never been. For a people who wanted more than anything to go on, the true horror was to stop. For a long time, passing that test was a privilege reserved for the very top. The oldest spells for navigating death, the ones carved into the walls of the Old Kingdom pyramids, belonged to the king alone. Eternity in those centuries was royal property. The pharaoh went on. Everyone else simply ended. But over the long span of Egyptian history, that changed. The spells began to spread downward. In the Middle Kingdom, they moved onto the coffins of nobles and officials, painted inside the wood where the dead could reach them. Eternity had widened to include the powerful, if not yet the poor. And then in the New Kingdom, it widened again. The spells were gathered into a text we call the Book of the Dead, and it was produced in quantity, copied out on papyrus and sold. A scribe could keep blank spaces in the scroll and write the buyer's name in later. Eternal life had become a product. If you could afford the scroll, you could carry the map to paradise with you into the tomb. Historians call this the democratization of the afterlife. Over 2,000 years, the promise of eternity traveled from the king's tomb to the marketplace. It never reached everyone, but it stopped being the possession of one man and became something a wider world could purchase and hope for. Underneath all of it, holding the entire structure up, was a single idea. The Egyptians divided existence into two forces in permanent tension. On one side stood Ma'at, the same truth measured against the heart. Order. Balance. The way things were supposed to be. On the other stood Isfet, which was chaos, falsehood, the disorder that pressed in from every edge of the world. Ma'at was not only a goddess. She was the principle that made the whole civilization cohere. The flood arriving on time was Ma'at. A fair verdict in a courtroom was Ma'at. The king on his throne, holding the country together, was Ma'at. And every one of these was a small victory over Isfet, which never stopped pushing back. This is the spine that runs through everything else. The care taken with the dead, the honesty demanded at the scale, the daily work of keeping the ditches clear and the records straight. All of it was the same labor, repeated at every scale. The endless holding of order against the chaos that wanted in. And it shaped how they saw the divine in ways that are easy to misread. Look at Egyptian religion from a distance, and it can seem like a worship of animals. Gods with the heads of falcons and jackals and cats. Sacred bulls. Millions of mummified creatures buried in the desert. It is tempting to conclude that the Egyptians simply prayed to beasts. They did not. What looks like animal worship was something more precise. A particular animal was understood as a vessel, a living expression of a god's nature, not the god itself. The falcon soared and struck and saw from a great height, and so the falcon carried something of Horus, the sky god. The cat was watchful and fierce in defense of its young, and so it belonged to the protective goddess. The animal was a manifestation, not a deity. When an Egyptian bowed before a falcon, he was not praying to that bird. He was recognizing a divine power that the bird made visible. The distinction mattered to them, even if it has often been lost on those who came after. Still, that recognition ran deep, deep enough to become law and reflex. Some animals were held so sacred that harming one was unthinkable, and none more so than the cat. The cat belonged to Bastet, and to kill one was among the gravest things a person could do. Even an accident offered no protection. The Greek writer Diodorus recorded what he saw in Egypt under the Ptolemies. A Roman, a member of the ruling power in the land, killed a cat. It may have been by accident. It made no difference. A crowd gathered, and the crowd could not be stopped. They fell on the man and killed him in a country that had every reason to fear Roman reprisal. Reverence for the animal ran deeper than the fear of Rome. Yet for all the grandeur of the great gods, the divine that most Egyptians lived beside was smaller and closer to home. In the ordinary house, far from the temple, people turned to protectors of a more intimate kind. The gods of the temple governed the cosmos. The gods of the household governed the night, the doorway, the birthing bed. One of them was Bez, and he did not look like a god at all. He was squat and grotesque, a dwarf with a lion's face and a lolling tongue, and people loved him. Bez guarded the home. He watched over sleep, chased away the dangers that came in the dark, and stood beside women in the terror of childbirth. His ugliness was his power. It frightened away what would harm the family. Beside him stood Tauret, who took the form of a pregnant hippopotamus rising on her hind legs. She was fearsome to look at, and she was fiercely kind. Tauret protected women through pregnancy and labor, the most dangerous passage in an ordinary life. These were the gods people actually prayed to, day by day. Not the distant lords of judgment, but the household guardians who kept a family alive through the night. And the color those gods most often came in was a particular blue-green, glinting from amulets and beads in ordinary hands. It was faience, and it was everywhere. A glazed ceramic, cheap to make and endlessly useful, turned into charms and jewelry and small figures and tiles. The poor could own it. The color of the gods was not locked away in temples. It sat in the palm of a working man. That color was not chosen at random. The Egyptians called faience senet, a word that meant something like that which is dazzling or that which gleams. Its shine was meant to call to mind the glitter of water and the light of the sun, the two things that made life possible. In a single cheap material, decoration and theology fused. To hold a faience amulet was to hold a small piece of the shine of life itself, the same blue-green they associated with rebirth. Rebirth, though, took work. It took an industry. Because before any soul could face the scale, the body it would return to had to be made to last. And that was a craft as organized as any in Egypt. Embalming was not a mournful improvisation. It was a workflow, standardized and scheduled, running to a fixed rhythm of roughly 70 days from beginning to end. It was religious and industrial at once, part sacred rite and part manufacturing process. The body arrived, and a sequence of practiced hands went to work on it, step by step, toward a finished result. The first task was to stop decay, and that meant removing what would rot. Here the Egyptians made a choice that still surprises us. The organs came out. But the brain, the organ we prize above all others, they treated as waste. To them it was stuffing, useless matter with no role in thought or memory. They scrambled it and threw it away. The heart was another matter entirely. The heart stayed. They believed it was the true center of a person, the seat of intellect, of memory, of the moral weight that would one day be measured on the scale. So the heart was left in place, or carefully returned, protected by an amulet. The Egyptians kept the organ we now consider a simple pump, and discarded the one we consider ourselves. The way they removed the brain was as strange as the decision to remove it. They did not open the skull. Instead, the embalmers passed a long hooked tool up through the nostril, breaking the brain apart inside the head and drawing it out through the nose in pieces. Then they rinsed the empty cavity clean. The face kept its shape. The seat of thought, as they saw it, was pulled out through the nose and thrown away. This was skilled, expensive work, and like any service it came at different prices. The embalmers offered tiers. A family could choose the level of preservation they were willing to pay for. There was the full and costly treatment reserved for the wealthy and a cheaper, faster method for those with less. Eternity was sold in packages. How well your body was made to last depended on what your family could spend. And preservation was only the beginning of what the tomb had to provide. The dead had to be equipped for a whole existence, and the Egyptians equipped them through images. The walls of a tomb were covered in painted scenes. Fields of grain, tables of food, servants at work, games waiting to be played. These were not decoration. They were a supply list. The belief was that these painted things could be activated. Through the right rituals and spells, the images would become real for the dead. They would switch on in the next world to feed and serve and entertain the person forever. A painted loaf became bread. A painted ox became meat. The tomb was not a gallery. It was a storehouse stocked with everything a soul would need, waiting to be turned on. But an eternity spent as an idealized Egypt carried an inconvenient truth. Egypt ran on labor. The fields had to be worked, the canals cleared, the harvest brought in. And the Egyptians assumed the next world would be no different. Even paradise, they feared, would come with a summons to work. Their solution was to send substitutes. Into the tomb they placed small figures called shabti, sometimes by the dozen, sometimes by the 100. Each was inscribed with a spell. When the call to labor came in the afterlife, when the dead were summoned to dig or plow or carry, the shabti would answer in their master's place. Here am I, the figure was made to say. The wealthy packed their tombs with a workforce of proxies so that eternity's own labor draft would fall on someone else. There was one more step before the tomb could be sealed, and it addressed a problem in the whole scheme. A preserved body was still a body. It could not see, or breathe, or eat, or speak. All the food painted on the walls, all the offerings left at the door, were useless to a corpse whose senses had shut down. Eternity did not begin on its own. It had to be switched on. The ritual that did this was called the opening of the mouth. A priest stood before the mummy, or before a statue of the dead. He touched its face with a special implement, an adze shaped like the tools of a craftsman. Touch by touch, he reactivated the senses. The mouth was opened so it could eat and speak. The eyes were opened so they could see. Only then could the dead receive what had been left for them. A priest had to reach out and by hand turn the person back on. There is a bitter irony in all of this, and it fell on the men who did the work. The embalmers were essential. Without them, no one reached eternity. They handled the most sacred passage a person could make, and their skill was the difference between continuation and oblivion. And yet they were treated as unclean. Because they touched the dead, they carried a ritual impurity, and society kept them at its margins. The men who secured everyone's eternity were held apart for the very hands that did it. The bodies they made were meant to last forever, and in a sense they did. They lasted long enough to be dug up thousands of years later by people who had no idea what they were holding. And here the story takes a turn that the Egyptians could never have foreseen. For centuries, in Europe, people ate them. It began with a word and a mistake about that word. There was a substance the medieval world prized as medicine, a dark natural bitumen that seeped from the ground in parts of Persia. In Persian it was called mumia. Physicians believed it could heal wounds, mend bones, cure a long list of ailments, and it was rare and costly. Then the word slipped its meaning. Somewhere in translation, mumia the bitumen became confused with the blackened, resin-soaked bodies coming out of Egyptian tombs. The corpses looked as though they were coated in the same dark substance. The corpses, people concluded, must hold the same healing power. The name had jumped from a mineral to the dead, and the dead inherited the reputation of the medicine. And so a trade was born. Egyptian mummies were ground into powder and sold across Europe as a cure. For hundreds of years, people swallowed the remains of the ancient dead, believing they were taking medicine. The great project of Egyptian eternity was the careful preservation of the body, so the soul could return to it. For countless individuals it ended not in the field of reeds, but in a European apothecary's jar. Undone, in the end, by a single mistranslated word. There is a temptation to speak of ancient Egypt as a single long afternoon, unchanging, the same country for 3,000 years. It was never that. It rose and fell and rose again in waves. Historians named the high tides, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom. Between them lie the low troughs, the periods when the center could not hold. They call these the intermediate periods, and they were times of fracture. The single crown split into rival crowns. Foreign families slipped into the delta. The land came apart along its old seams. And then, each time, it was gathered back together, What we flatten into one word, Egypt, was really a long cycle of collapse and reassembly. The same grammar of kingship, spoken again and again by different mouths. The first great unraveling came at the end of the Old Kingdom. The pyramids were already built. The central state that had raised them simply lost its grip. For a long time, the story told was a story of weather. The floods had failed. Year after year, the river came up short, the harvests thinned, and famine walked through the provinces, while the capital could no longer feed them. There is truth in this. A run of low floods really did coincide with the collapse, and hungry provinces do not obey a distant king. But the river alone did not do it. Local governors had been growing stronger for generations, keeping more for themselves and sending less to the center. When the crown weakened, they simply stopped pretending to obey it. They ruled their provinces as small kings, and the country dissolved into their competing hands. The failure was human as much as it was hydrological. The Nile helped break the state it had built, but it had help. The story of low floods is true, and it is not the whole truth. A river can starve a kingdom, but only after the men who ran it have already begun to let it fall apart. Egypt reassembled, ruled again from a single throne, and then came apart a second time. And in that second fracture, something arrived from outside that would change the shape of Egyptian power forever. Foreign rulers had settled in the northern delta, and history remembers them as the Hyksos. To later Egyptians, their presence was a wound, a humiliation, a time when the sacred land answered to strangers. But the strangers did not come empty-handed. They brought the horse. They brought the war chariot, a light, fast, spoked-wheeled platform that turned a battlefield into something new. 2 horses, a driver, an archer, moving faster than any man on foot could answer. Egypt had never fought this way before. Its soldiers had marched and thrown spears, while the world beyond its borders was learning to ride. The occupation that shamed them also rearmed them. The very weapon that helped foreigners hold the delta would, in time, become the weapon Egypt used to build an empire of its own. When the reckoning came, it came from the south. A prince named Ahmose gathered the strength of Upper Egypt and drove the Hyksos out of the delta and beyond the frontier. He did not stop at the old border. He pushed on past it, chasing the memory of invasion out into foreign country, so no such threat could gather there again. The land was whole once more. But the Egypt that emerged from that war was not the inward-looking country it had been before. Something in the trauma had changed it. A kingdom that had once spent its energy building tombs and tending its own fields now looked outward, and it looked outward armed. This was the birth of the new kingdom, Egypt as empire, its borders pushed into Nubia and the Levant. Its armies rode the very chariots a foreign enemy had taught it to fear. Invasion had turned a farming civilization into a military one. No ruler embodied that new imperial confidence more than the man who would wear the crown for 2/3 of a century. Ramesses II reigned for 66 years. He lived so long that he outlasted his own heirs, watching son after son die before him. He fathered more than 100 children. And he understood something about memory that few rulers ever grasp, that if you build enough and live long enough, you become the past itself. He covered Egypt in stone. colossal statues of himself rose at temple gates across the land. Each one taller than a house, each one staring out over the centuries with the same calm face. Longevity became a policy. Outlive everyone, then outbuild them until the country cannot remember a time before you. By the end of his reign, almost no one alive could. A whole generation had been born, grown old, and died under the same king. To them, Ramesses was not a ruler. He was simply the shape the world had always had. Among all that stone, one story was carved again and again, larger and prouder each time. It was the story of Kadesh, a great battle fought against the Hittite Empire in the north. On temple walls across Egypt, Ramesses appears alone in his chariot, reins tied around his waist, scattering his enemies single-handedly. A lone king saving his whole army through sheer courage. It is a magnificent image. It is also not quite what happened. The Battle of Kadesh was, in truth, a draw, a bloody, inconclusive clash that settled nothing on the day. The Hittites went home and told the same story with themselves as the victors. Ramesses simply told it louder, and in stone, which lasts longer than any rival's memory. Carve a version of events large enough, in enough places, and it stops being a claim. It becomes the record. For thousands of years, anyone walking those temple walls saw only the king's triumph, never the draw beneath it. It is one of the oldest examples we have of a ruler turning a stalemate into a personal victory, and then daring the future to disagree. The future, for a very long time, did not. Kingship in Egypt, then, was as much about the telling as the doing, and the tellers were not always who we imagine. The queen most bound to Egypt in the modern mind was not Egyptian at all. Cleopatra came from a Greek Macedonian line, the house of Ptolemy, descendants of one of Alexander's generals. For nearly 300 years that family ruled the Nile without troubling to speak its language. They governed an Egyptian people in Greek, keeping the old tongue at arm's length. Cleopatra was the exception. She was, by the accounts that survive, the only ruler of her entire dynasty who bothered to learn Egyptian. The woman we picture as the face of ancient Egypt was a foreigner who had to study the country she embodied. Her family were only the last in a long procession. Across its final centuries, Egypt was conquered again and again by Libyans, by Nubians, by Assyrians, by Persians, by Macedonians, and at last by Rome. 6 waves of foreign power broke over the same shore. And yet something strange happened each time. The conquerors did not erase Egypt. Egypt absorbed the conquerors. To rule the Nile, again and again, foreign kings found they had to become pharaohs. They built the temples, wore the crowns, spoke the old formulas, and bowed to the old gods. Egypt kept losing on the battlefield and winning in the temple. It swallowed the very powers that defeated it, dressing them in its own ancient clothes until they looked like something that had always belonged. The clearest example of this came not from the north, but from the south. When the kingdom of Kush, deep in Nubia, grew strong enough to conquer Egypt, its kings did not arrive as destroyers. They arrived as restorers. This 25th dynasty, the Black Pharaohs of the south, ruled as the most traditional of Egyptians. They repaired temples that had fallen into neglect. They revived older artistic styles, reaching back past recent centuries to the crisp lines of the Old Kingdom. They wanted to be more Egyptian than the Egyptians, more faithful to the old ways than the people who had let them slip. A land that had once looked south and seen only subjects now looked south and saw its guardians. A people once dismissed as Egypt's lesser neighbors became, for a time, the careful keepers of Egyptian tradition. The conquerors from Kush were not the end of the old ways. They were, for a generation, its guardians. Not every threat to the old ways came from outside. One of the strangest ruptures in all of Egyptian history was engineered from the very top, by a pharaoh who tried to remake the heavens. In the 18th dynasty, a king named Amenhotep IV abandoned the name he was born with and became Akhenaten. He turned his back on the vast, crowded pantheon his ancestors had worshipped, the falcon-headed, the ram-headed, the whole teeming company of gods. In their place, he raised a single power to absolute supremacy. The Aten, the disk of the sun itself, its rays ending in small human hands. The old temples were closed. The old names were suppressed. He built a new capital from bare desert, a city dedicated to the sun, and moved the whole court there, away from the ancient centers of worship. Everything the people had known about the divine was rewritten in a single lifetime. It was one of the most abrupt religious revolutions ever imposed by a single will. Scholars still argue over what exactly Akhenaten built. Some early writers called it the first true monotheism, a startling leap toward the idea of one god above all others. Others are more cautious. They point out that Akhenaten never denied the other gods existed. He simply forbade their worship and demanded devotion to one. That is not quite monotheism. It might be better called henotheism or monolatry, the exaltation of a single god without erasing the rest. The distinction seems small, but it decides something large. It decides whether this pharaoh was a lonely prophet ahead of his age, or simply a king who chose one god and turned away from the others. Whatever the theology, the politics beneath it were plain enough. The priesthood of Amun had grown enormously wealthy and powerful, controlling vast estates and vast influence, a rival center of gravity to the throne itself. By elevating a new god, one with no established priesthood, no entrenched temples, no old families, Akhenaten cut that power off at the root. He and his queen Nefertiti positioned themselves as the sole channels between the people and the divine. To reach the Aten, one had to go through the royal couple. The revolution in heaven was also a seizure of power on earth, a way to break the priests who had grown too strong. It did not survive him. A reform held together by one man's will tends to die when that will is gone, and Akhenaten's died fast. His successors restored the old gods almost the moment he was buried. They abandoned the gleaming new city he had built in the desert and let it fall to ruin. And then they did something more deliberate. They went to the official lists of kings, the sacred record of who had ruled Egypt, and they scratched his name out. He was not to be remembered as a heretic. He was not to be remembered at all. Egypt's answer to the pharaoh who tried to rewrite the heavens was to erase him from the record of the earth. For all these upheavals of crown and god, the deepest continuities in Egyptian life ran quieter, and often through the hands of women. To the Greeks, who came later and wrote much of what the West first believed about Egypt, one thing seemed almost unnatural. Egyptian women were free in ways Greek women were not. An Athenian woman lived her whole life under the guardianship of a man, a father, a husband, a son. She could not own significant property or represent herself in court. An Egyptian woman could stand in her own name. To Greek eyes, accustomed to their own arrangements, this was strange, foreign, a world turned around. The freedom was not a matter of custom alone. It was written into law and daily practice. From the Old Kingdom onward, Egyptian women could buy and sell land, inherit it, and pass it on in wills of their own making. They could sign contracts. They could bring a lawsuit to court and argue it as themselves without a man speaking for them. This was ordinary. A woman appearing before a magistrate over a disputed field or an unpaid debt was not a scandal or an exception. It was simply how the system worked. Legal personhood for women 1,000 years before it was normal almost anywhere else. Marriage carried the same balance. It was a civil arrangement, not a sacred bond sealed by a temple, and either partner could end it. A wife could initiate a divorce as readily as a husband, and the law gave her real protection against being cast aside. A husband who divorced his wife without cause had to return her entire dowry. He could forfeit as much as 1/3 of the wealth the couple had built together. Ending a marriage carelessly was expensive. The rules did not simply free a woman to leave. They made sure a man could not discard her and keep everything. She walked out with what she had brought, and a share of what they had made. There was money in the balance, and the balance leaned toward fairness. That standing showed up in the professions too. In the 4th dynasty, in the age of the Great Pyramids, a woman named Pesishet held a remarkable title. She was the overseer of female physicians. The title matters for what it implies. It means there was not merely a woman who practiced medicine, but an organized body of women doctors, numerous enough to require supervision, and a woman placed in charge of them. Female medicine in Egypt was not a lucky exception here and there. It was an institution structured and titled with Pesishet somewhere near its head in the age of the Great Pyramids. Around those titled physicians moved a wider world of healers. Not everyone who cured was a doctor with a formal office. In the villages there were folk healers of every kind, working with remedies passed down and spells spoken over the sick. One specialist was known as the scorpion charmer, a person who treated venomous stings with a blend of botanical medicine and magical incantation. In the desert, where a scorpion's sting could kill, such a person was worth having near. The line between medicine and magic was thin and often invisible. Both the titled physician and the village charmer were taken seriously, because in a land full of venom, both sometimes worked. Women did not only serve the state, sometimes they ruled it. Several times across 3,000 years, when a dynasty had no clear male heir, a woman took the throne as pharaoh in her own right. Sebek-Neferu in the Middle Kingdom, Hatshepsut, Nefer-Neferuaten, and Tosret in the New. Female rule was never the ordinary course of things, but it was not unthinkable either. It was a recognized mechanism, a way to keep a royal line alive when the usual path had failed. A woman on the throne was a fallback the system allowed, not an aberration to be hidden away in shame. Of these, Hatshepsut ruled longest and left the most behind. And she solved the strange problem of female kingship in a way that reveals how carefully the office was understood. In her statues and her public images, she took on the traditional trappings of a pharaoh. The pleated kilt, the false ceremonial beard, the whole visual language of male kingship. But she never truly disguised herself. In the written inscriptions beneath those images, the grammar stayed feminine. She was, in her own texts, still a woman. She performed the office as male in image, because the office had always been imagined as male, while never once denying in words who she actually was. The intimacy of these lives reaches us in smaller ways too, in the ordinary problems of ordinary bodies. A woman who thought she might be pregnant had a test she could perform, and it was stranger and cleverer than it sounds. She would take barley and wheat and moisten them day by day with her own urine. If the grains sprouted, she was pregnant. It sounds like pure folklore, and yet when the method was tried in a laboratory in the 1960s, it worked. It correctly flagged pregnancy about 70% of the time. The hormones in a pregnant woman's body really do encourage the seeds to germinate. The old test had stumbled, without knowing it, onto a thread of real endocrinology wrapped inside a piece of kitchen magic. The ancient healers could not have said why it worked. They only knew that it did, often enough to trust it. A true thing understood through the wrong reason, waiting 3,000 years for someone to explain it. Beneath all of this lay a single idea about what a king was actually for. The collapses and reassemblies, the foreign kings turned pharaoh, the heretic erased, the women standing in their own names, all of it rested on one thing. The pharaoh's deepest duty was not conquest and not building. It was maintenance. He existed to uphold Ma'at, the order and truth and balance that held the cosmos together, and to hold back Isfet, the chaos that always pressed against it. When a king died, it was thought that chaos gathered at the edges waiting. It pressed in at the moment the throne stood empty, until a successor took up the burden and pushed it back once more. This is why the succession mattered so much, and why an empty throne was feared. A land without a king was a land the darkness could enter. The throne was not a prize. It was a post. Kingship, in the end, was the daily work of standing between the world and the dark and refusing to let it in. A throne held that line for as long as one life could hold it. Then the life ended, and another took up the post, and the count of lives grew long. It grew so long that the numbers themselves begin to slip out of reach. Cleopatra stood near the end of that count, the last famous name Egypt would give the world. And she stood closer in time to the first steps taken on the moon than to the workers who raised the Great Pyramid. The stone she could have touched was already older to her than she is to us. That distance is hard to feel from the inside. Between the pyramid at Giza and Cleopatra's own lifetime lie something like 2,500 years. Between her death and the landing at Tranquility Base lie roughly 2,000 more. She was not looking back at a recent age. She was looking back across a gulf as wide as the one that separates her from a television screen. A scribe working in her court could have written a document in a familiar hand, in a familiar office. The shape of that office, the gods it served, the accounting it kept, would have carried forward from far earlier. It would still have been recognizable to a scribe who lived 2,500 years before him. The continuity is the truly disorienting part. Not that Egypt was old, but that it stayed itself for so long that its own antiquity became ordinary to it. And when she looked, the thing she saw did not look the way it looks now. The Great Pyramid in her day still wore its original skin. Polished white Torah limestone cased the whole structure, smooth and unbroken, catching the sun. This was not the stepped brown core that visitors climb toward today. That casing was a mountain of blocks fitted so closely that the joints all but disappeared. Where we see rough stairs, she would have seen a single clean face, angled toward the light. It gleamed. A traveler on the river would have seen it flare against the desert, a slope of white fire rather than a heap of stone. On a bright morning, the reflection would have been almost too much to look at directly. The monument announced itself for miles before a traveler reached it. What survives today is the wound beneath that skin. The stones exposed after the casing was stripped away for other buildings across later centuries. The version we call ancient is a stripped and weathered thing. The version Cleopatra inherited already dazzled and was already impossibly old. Egyptians did not merely live beside their deep past. They tended it. By Cleopatra's time, the pyramids at Giza were weathered monuments more than 2,000 years old, their builders long gone, their purpose half forgotten. Later dynasties restored them. Priests led what we might now recognize as tours. People came to stand before structures they could no longer fully read, in a script that had drifted beyond ordinary understanding. Egypt spent much of its own history as a visitor to itself, curating relics it had inherited from strangers who happened to share its land. Nothing shows this stranger loop more plainly than a slab of granite set between two vast stone pores. Around 1400 years before the Common Era, a young prince fell asleep in the shadow of the Great Sphinx. The monument was already ancient then, buried to its neck in drifting sand. In the prince's account, the Sphinx spoke to him. It promised him the throne of Egypt if he would only clear away the sand that was burying it. He did. He became Thutmose IV, and he set up a stone, the dream stele, to record the bargain. A new kingdom prince, digging out an old kingdom monument that was already a mystery to him. The distances stack inside a single story. To him the Sphinx was as remote and as wordless as the pyramids were to Cleopatra, and as all of it is to us. Egypt kept meeting its own past as something to be rescued, restored, and wondered at. The wonder was never a modern invention. It was there from the beginning, built into the long middle of the story itself. The most famous face this civilization now wears belonged to none of its great builders. It belonged to a boy. Tutankhamun ruled briefly, changed little, and died young. In the long ledger of pharaohs, he is a minor entry. His short reign would barely register beside the men who conquered, built, and reshaped the country over centuries. Under any ordinary reckoning, history should have forgotten him. His fame rests on an accident. Nearly every royal tomb in Egypt was emptied by robbers across the centuries, stripped of its gold and often of the dead themselves. His tomb was overlooked. Its entrance was buried and lost beneath the rubble of a later construction, and the thieves passed it by. When it was opened in the 20th century, it still held what the others had lost, room after room of untouched treasure. The most recognizable pharaoh in the world is famous not for his life, but for the survival of his afterlife. And with that survival came a story that was never Egyptian at all. When the boy king's tomb was opened in 1922, newspapers reached for something darker than archaeology. They spoke of a curse laid on those who disturbed the dead, of a doom written into the walls. There was no such inscription. No curse was ever carved in that tomb. The idea was manufactured in the press of the day, a rivalry between papers competing for a sensation. What we now recite as ancient superstition was invented within living memory, a modern ghost dressed in old linen. The Egyptians themselves had long since lost the ability to read their own oldest words. When Rome closed the pagan temples, the knowledge of how to read the sacred script went with them. The last people who could sound out the signs grew old and died, and taught no one. The signs remained everywhere, carved on walls and columns and tombs, but no living person could read them. For more than 1,000 years, the writing stared back in silence. An entire civilization's voice sat in plain view and said nothing. Travelers copied the shapes without understanding a word. Scholars guessed, and guessed wrongly, for generations certain the pictures were pure symbols with no sound behind them. Then, in 1822, a Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion saw past that assumption. He realized the pictures were not only pictures. Many of them carried sound, like the letters of an alphabet hidden inside the images. With that single insight, the silence broke. A script that had been mute for 1,000 years began, sign by sign, to speak again. The last person to write it fluently had done so long before. On the 24th of August, in the year 394 of the Common Era, a priest named Esmet Akom carved a dedication at the Temple of Philae. It honored a Nubian god. It was the final hieroglyphic inscription ever cut. A tradition of writing 3,000 years deep did not end by decree, and did not end in fire. It ended with one man, at one temple, leaving one last message on a wall, not knowing he would be the last. Yet the language did not vanish entirely. Its final form found a quiet refuge. Coptic, Egyptian, written in the letters of the Greek alphabet, became the tongue of Egypt's Christians. And it is chanted still in the liturgy of the Coptic Orthodox Church every week. In churches along the Nile, the descendant of the pharaoh's language is still sung aloud. It is carried in the mouths of worshippers who may not translate every word they voice. The speech that once belonged to the builders of temples survives now inside a church, worn thin but unbroken. The oldest continuous thread of the Egyptian language did not die. It slipped into prayer, and it stayed there. That survival did more than keep a prayer alive. Because Coptic preserved the actual sounds of the old language into modern times, it handed the decipherers something they could never have recovered from stone alone. The signs on the temple walls showed the shapes of words. Coptic still held their voices. When Champollion worked toward his breakthrough, it was this living speech that let him hear what the dead script had been saying. The prayers of Egyptian Christians carried the pronunciation their pagan ancestors had abandoned, and that echo helped unlock the whole. While scholars in Europe bent over these signs, a broader hunger was already loose. Egypt had seized the Western imagination in two great waves. The first came with Napoleon, whose 1798 expedition carried soldiers and scholars alike into the Nile Valley. His campaign failed as a war. But the scholars returned with drawings, measurements, and the Rosetta Stone, and those changed everything. Their published records put the ruins of Egypt into European hands for the first time. The second wave came more than a century later, with the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. The gold that emerged from that small, overlooked burial spread across the front pages of the world. Each wave flooded Europe and America with Egyptian images, Egyptian shapes, Egyptian dead. Fashion followed. Furniture followed. And each wave set off a fresh scramble for anything the country could be persuaded, purchased, or forced to give up. Some of what it gave up was the dead themselves, and the uses found for them grew strange. Ground-up mummies, human and feline both, were mixed with myrrh and pale pitch to make a pigment. Painters called it mummy brown and prized it for its warm, transparent shadow. For a stretch of the 19th century, the actual bodies of ancient Egyptians were smeared across European canvases as a color. The people who had spent 70 days being preserved for eternity ended up as a tube of paint on an artist's shelf. Not everyone could live with that knowledge once they had it. The painter Edward Burne-Jones was told one day exactly what his tube of mummy brown contained. He did not simply set it aside. He carried the tube out into his garden and buried it in the ground, giving it something like the right its contents had been denied. One small private funeral, decades and a continent removed from the Nile. The macabre trade of a whole century collided with a single conscience, and for one afternoon the conscience won. Elsewhere the collision never came. In fashionable homes, the ancient dead became an evening's entertainment. A host would acquire a mummy and invite guests to watch it opened. The linen was peeled back before the company, layer by layer, toward the thrill of the reveal. Sometimes amulets tumbled out from between the wrappings, small charms placed there to protect the dead, now passed around the room as party favors. The bodies were treated as curiosities, as souvenirs, as a way to fill a drawing room with talk. There was no thought of the 70 patient days that had gone into the wrapping. There was no thought of the family that had believed this careful work would carry someone into forever. People prepared with enormous tenderness for an eternal journey were undone for an hour of amusement, then quietly set aside. The monuments travelled too, though they were harder to lift. Obelisks that had stood in Egyptian sun for thousands of years were cut loose from their foundations and carried across the sea. One rose again in Paris. Others were raised in London and in New York. Two of them acquired a nickname, Cleopatra's Needles, though they had been carved for a pharaoh centuries before Cleopatra drew breath. The stones were raised to fix a single name in a single place. Now they stand in city squares an ocean away. They anchor capitals that did not exist when they were made. The fashion reached even into the design of death itself. In 1839, London's Highgate Cemetery opened in Egyptian Avenue, a row of tomb entrances framed in lotus columns and pharaonic lines. It was part of a wider Egyptian revival that spread across the century. Banks borrowed the shapes, hoping to look as permanent as a pyramid. Prisons borrowed them, hoping to look as immovable. Graveyards borrowed them most eagerly of all. Egypt's architecture of the afterlife had been built to carry souls into an idealized forever. Now it was recycled into the fashionable resting places of Victorian Europe. Its meaning arrived half remembered and half invented. The borrowing may run deeper still, into images we no longer think of as borrowed. For centuries, Egyptian art had shown the goddess Isis, seated with the infant god Horus at her breast, mother and divine child together. Some scholars trace a line from that image to the later Christian picture of the Virgin Mary nursing the infant Jesus. They argue that the widespread cult of Isis had already prepared the Mediterranean for a mother and holy child. Others point to the gaps in that lineage, the distances in time and place the idea would have had to cross. The case stays open and may never fully close. But the resemblance lingers, one faith's oldest image standing quietly behind another's. Not everything that endured was so grand. Some of what lasted longest was small enough to hold in one hand. The board game of Senet ran as a thread through nearly the whole of Egyptian history. It was some 2,000 years of play, from the earliest dynasties down into the age of foreign kings. It began as an ordinary race game, pieces moving square by square across a grid of 30 spaces. Families played it on scratched stone. The wealthy played it on inlaid wooden boards buried with them for company in the tomb. Over time, the game deepened. The board became a map of the soul's journey through the underworld, each square a stage in the passage toward eternity. To finish the game was to reach the field of reeds. A pastime and a prayer had grown into the same thing, played by the same hands. And it never quite let go. Grids for Senet were still being scratched into the roof of the temple at Dendera, as late as the 1st century of the Common Era. A single game tracks the whole arc of the culture, its shape unchanged, while its meaning drifted quietly toward the dead. Above the village where the tomb makers lived, another kind of watching went on. A natural peak rose over Deir el Medina, shaped like a pyramid, and the workers gave it a name and a face. They called her Meret Seger, she who loves silence. She was a cobra goddess, and she saw everything the village did. She was believed to strike the tomb robber and the oathbreaker with venom and with blindness, punishing the betrayals that the tombs beneath her were most vulnerable to. The mountain that stood over every workman's day was not a backdrop. It was a goddess, and she was watching for a lie. Yet she was not only a threat. When a workman fell ill, he did not always read his sickness as bad luck. He read it as Meret Seger's displeasure, and he answered it in the only way that made sense to him. He would carve a small limestone stela. On it, he would confess the fault he believed had angered her, and beg her to forgive him. These were not grand monuments. They were personal, awkward, honest, the private apologies of ordinary men to the mountain above their homes. And in his own account, when he repented, she came to him. One such man recorded that she returned to him as a sweet breeze, and that his illness lifted. The goddess who could strike with venom could also arrive as cool air on a fevered body. Sickness and recovery were told not as biology, but as a quarrel with a goddess, and then a reconciliation, high on the silent peak above the tombs. For thousands of years, the whole of this world rested on a single rhythm. The river rose each summer, spread its black silt across the fields, and withdrew. Everything stood on that pulse. The calendar was cut to it, divided into the seasons of the flood, the planting, and the harvest. The taxes were set by the height the water reached. The gods themselves were understood through its rise and fall. It had run since before there was an Egypt to notice it running. And then, within living memory, it stopped. The Aswan High Dam, finished in 1970, closed across the Nile and held the flood back for good. The fields below it would still be watered, but on a schedule set by engineers now, released through gates rather than delivered by the river. The black silt that had built the farmland for millennia settled instead behind the wall, sinking to the floor of a new lake. The land stopped being remade each year. It began, for the first time, to be managed. The scale of the thing that ended it is hard to place beside the thing it ended. The dam is built from something on the order of 44 million cubic meters of material. That is roughly the bulk of 17 great pyramids, gathered into a single wall of stone and earth. Behind it, a reservoir swallowed the old cycle whole. The annual flood, the oldest clock this civilization ever kept, simply ceased to turn. The rhythm had outlasted the pharaohs. It had outlasted the language and even the memory of how to read the walls. And it was stopped at last by a monument larger than any the pharaohs had ever dared to raise. The river is quiet now. The flood that shaped everything has been stilled. And yet its shape remains, pressed into a way of living that outlasted almost every other. What endured was never really the stone. It was the pattern underneath it. A rhythm of work and rest, of care for the dead, and accounts kept for the living. A people who believed that a thing written down might hold. They built for eternity, and eternity came for them slowly. Their words fell silent for 1,000 years, then spoke again. And what finally reached us was not the grandeur they trusted. It was the small, unguarded things left behind by ordinary days. Perhaps that is the quiet gift of a civilization that grew ancient to itself. What we build to last is not always what survives. Sometimes it is only the humble thing, forgotten, that lasts. The river will not flood again. But the black silt is still down there, deep in the fields, holding the years it carried. Let the day fall away. Let the river run quiet in your mind. And let yourself drift into the soft silence that has covered this valley for 3,000 years,